Welcome to Top Notch Farming. For today, SaskCanola is partnered with Sask Barley, Alberta canola, and Manitoba canola growers to deliver these presentations to you. My name is Keith Fournier, and I'm a Director and Research Chair of SaskCanola, and I'm happy to be chairing today's webinar session. We're glad to have you joining us here today for the third of 4 webinars in 2021 Top Notch Farming webinar series. We certainly miss being able to see you in person and all the networking that goes on between farmers and the industry members at those sessions. But we're also thankful for the technology that we have available to us, which allows us to bring this information direct to your homes and offices. Information that could be used in the upcoming growing season. The 4 webinars in this series covered a wide range of topics. They included the blackleg and verticillium stripe management, which is on January 22nd, and clubroot management, which is on February the 11th. Links to these 2 webinars are typed into the chat box, but you could also find them on the SaskCanola website at any time. Today is the harvest and storage management, and on March 14th is the soil management webinar. We invite everyone to join us for that upcoming webinar. A few housekeeping items before the presentation. The continuing education credits are available for certified crop advisors and certified science consultants. To earn credits, you can scan the QR code, which will be displayed at the end of the last presentation using the CCA app, or type your full name, CCA, or CCSC number into the chat box. We will fill in the sign-in sheet for you and send it to the appropriate person. If anyone has any questions during the presentation, you may type them into the Q&A box in the right-hand corner of the control panel. There will be a 30-minute Q&A session at the end of the presentation, and we will look forward to answering your questions at that time. During the presentation, you will be muted, so there will be no feedback to interfere with the audio. We also encourage you to use the chat box to add to the discussion on each topic. But if there's a question you wish to have answered, please use the Q&A box. This webinar will be recorded, and the link will be sent to you at a later date. I am pleased to introduce our first speaker, Charley Sprenger. Charley Sprenger is a project leader at Prairie Agricultural Machinery Institute, better known as PAMI. Her work is focused mainly on engineering research to develop farming best management practices. She's going to give a research update on best management practices for using supplemental heating with natural air drying in the next 30 minutes. Please welcome Charley.
Thanks, Keith. I'm just going to share my screen here. Alrighty, so I think my screen should be up. And so, yeah, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Happy to be invited and share some updates on kind of some material that we put together on using supplemental heat with natural air drying. And some of this came about from a research project that we had funded by SaskCanola and Sask Wheat that ended in 2019. We've had a few other projects kind of build on this, but this is kind of a summary of what we've learned to date and material we put on our website. So I'll just go through, just highlight on some of the basics of storage and natural air drying as context, if just to make sure everybody's on the same page, and then how we can use supplemental heat to extend the drying season. Go over some types of heating systems and how to size those, as well as look at the economics of using supplemental heat. And I'll just kind of throw in some of the results from those trials that I had talked about, and end it off with some of the best management practices that we put together. So what's the issue in any case of storage management? The risk of wet grain or hot grain can spoil during storage, we know that. And the risk of spoilage depends on both temperature and moisture. So we want to control that in bin Even though cool grain is, if it's tough, it's still at the risk of spoilage. But unfortunately, natural air drying rates, how quickly or how effectively we can use natural air drying in bins, the ability to do that drops when the ambient temperature is below 10 degrees. So late in the fall, or if we have cool, damp seasons, that might not be an option. So coming up with some options. Of course, these are the safe storage conditions that we're looking at. For here is canola and wheat. These are put together by the Canadian Grain Commission. So kind of that range of, we want our safe storage is, we usually say around below 10 to 15 degrees C temperature, and the moisture depends on the commodity. So we can control the temperature and the moisture in the bin by blowing air through it. We refer to temperature control as using aeration, not adding any heat, but we're even at the temperature profile with low airflow rates, around 0.1 CFM per bushel. And then when we want to dry, we call that natural air drying, and we use the air's natural capacity to dry, which I'll explain in a minute, to control both temperature and moisture, and we do that with higher airflow rates of around 1 CFM per bushel. And lastly, when we need more moisture control, we often go towards a heated air dryer, uses really high airflow rates and really much higher temperatures to dry the grain quickly, and then cool it down before putting it in storage. So the aeration and natural air drying are in-bin methods that we can use without a dryer. So just kind of this is an example of one of our research projects, but to look at how airflow rate affects drying rate. So we're looking at the moisture content dropping, and so at a 2 CFM per bushel, this blue line, we see a much higher rate of drying in the grain over a period of time, compared to what we consider aeration rates of, this is the gray line, very little moisture removal. It kind of just maintains the conditions. So airflow rate depends on resistance to airflow, which is impacted by the grain type. So each commodity has a different relationship. Of course, smaller seeds, such as canola, there's less airspace between them, and so higher resistance in the bin, whereas larger ones, it's easier to push air through. As well as the relationship is directly related to depth. So deeper bins full of grain will require more fan capacity to push to achieve the same airflow rate. And lastly, the faster you try and push air through, there'll be some additional resistance. So each commodity has these airflow resistance charts that can be used in order to size the fan that you need on your bin, depending on what you're trying to achieve. So if you need to get those higher airflow rates for drying, then you use those curves. And these are available at PAMI.ca on our reference material. And you can use I'll just kind of jump over this, but you can install gauges on your fan outlet and can use that static pressure reading to determine the airflow rate for your fan. There'll be fan curves specifically for your fan. So I mentioned that there's a difference between natural air drying and heated air drying. And then we kind of find a middle ground where we don't want to invest in capital for our using a dedicated heated air dryer, or you don't have utility available. And so this is where we can possibly add supplemental heat using the same principles as natural air drying in bin at about that 1 CFM per bushel rate. But when we add heat, which I'll explain in a minute, It increases the air's ability to dry grain, and we can turn a poor grain drying day into a better one. So when I mention the air's capacity to dry, it refers to how much space within the air is able to take on water and remove it from the grain. So sometimes we can have comparable RHs at night or during the day, but warmer air, even at a similar relative humidity, will actually have more water holding capacity because the air expands and can take on more moisture. So we use this cup analogy and to show that cool air at night just has a small amount of moisture that it can take up in the small cup, but the warm air cup above has, on a volume perspective, can take on more water. So when we take that cool air cup and we warm that air up, we still have the same volume of moisture in the air, but now we have a larger cup, and so now there's more water holding capacity. So this is kind of the analogy that we use to explain why supplemental heat is advantageous. So we want to warm up and make that cup bigger and increase the amount of water holding capacity. So these are equilibrium moisture content charts that we use to determine when the air that you're putting into the bin has the capacity to dry. So these relationships have been put together. So based on the temperature and relative humidity of the air, these are commodity specific. That's the corresponding value is what the grain moisture content will trend towards after a period of time. So in this case, for wheat, if we had ambient air at 70% humidity and 10 degrees Celsius, the grain would only eventually equilibrate to 15.7%, which we know is not considered dry. We want it down below 14.5. And instead, these values in red are what the conditions that would be ideal for drying grain in bin using natural air drying. So ideally we'd like humidities below 65% and temperatures in the 10 to 22 degree range. So as I mentioned, good drying weather requires temperatures above 10 degrees and less than 65 or 70 relative humidity. But unfortunately in the prairies the ambient temperatures drop below 10 degrees in mid to late September, and that's during peak harvest season. So if we use supplemental heating to increase that ambient temperature, we can extend that good drying weather into later in November, ideally, rather than relying on ambient conditions. So our rule of thumb for supplemental adding heat is that for every 10 degrees of heat that you add to the air temperature, the humidity of the air is cut in half. So it's not a perfect relationship, but that's kind of the rule of thumb in the range of temperatures that we're looking at. So if our ambient conditions were less than ideal, 70% and 5 degrees, we wouldn't see any drying of the grain if we use this. But if we were to add 10 degrees to bump that inlet temperature to 15, we'd actually be seeing a humidity of the air going into the bin around 35, which would mean that our grain moisture would eventually trend down towards closer to 10. We obviously don't need it to go that way, but at least it would drive that moisture removal in the right direction we're looking for, and we would stop it when the grain on average is dry. So the key thing to remember, if you take anything away from the principles, is that supplemental heat's not the same as heated air drying, in that heated air drying uses much higher temperatures and the high airflow rates. And with supplemental heating, we're using typical natural air drying airflow rates around that 1 CFM per bushel. So we need to use moderate temperatures because the temperature draws the moisture out of the kernel, whereas the airflow rate is what moves it out of the grain mass. So we need to balance the moisture removal rate from the kernel and the removal rate from the bin using the airflow rate. We don't want to add too much heat, draw that moisture out and have it just sit in the grain, creating a wet spot instead of moving it right out of the bin. So how do we add heat to a natural air drying fan? There are multiple sources of heat, electricity, propane, natural gas, or diesel. So there's indirect heating where the fuel is used to heat water and then pass it through a heat exchanger, or there's a couple different options. And then direct heat is where the flames directly used to heat the air. So this is quite common in a lot of systems, adding even a construction heater to the fan inlet. So sometimes people say, well, the byproduct of combustion is water and CO2. So by using direct heating, are we actually being counterproductive and adding water to the inlet? So we're adding moisture to the grain. That doesn't seem to make sense. But if you actually look at it, propane, for example, it generates about 93 pounds of water per million BTU, which works out to be on a airflow rate of about 5,000 CFM and aiming for a target increase of 10 degrees. It works out to be about 7 pounds of water per hour that we're adding to the bin. But when you compare that to how much water you're removing from the grain, if this is 5,000 bushels of tough wheat, and we're assuming about a 0.5% to 1% per day is being removed, then, I don't have my numbers here. It actually works out to be about 123 pounds per hour of water that you're removing. So when you compare that to, 75 to 50 is here. Sorry, that is there. It's hidden behind the screen. So the comparison, the relative amount that you're adding versus what you're taking out is at least 10 times. So fairly negligible in all sense of things, and your direct heating systems are more efficient. So in addition to direct versus indirect, we can either add heat upstream or downstream. Upstream being before the fan, definitely easier to implement. It's definitely suitable for retrofitting onto bins that already have fans. You could even move it between bins depending on where you need it. There is some risk that the flame could be pulled into the fan or motor and cause damage or result in a fire risk. So making sure that the setup is heaters are CSA approved and that you consider that they're safely installed, try not to do what we consider the duct tape type of retrofitting. So make sure you really think about safety. Downstream heating, on the other hand, would be between the fan and the bin. These are likely more energy efficient because you're pushing heat directly. That's not as much losses, and it doesn't expose the fan to increased temperature, but you can't move it between bins. So it's kind of more a permanent installation if you're thinking about a new setup. And this is an example of an indirect system, the dry air system in comparison. So you could have multiple bins set up on the same indirect line. So going about sizing a heater for supplemental heating, capacity depends on the temperature increase and the airflow rate for the bin. So the equation that we typically use is actually the third one, looking at BTU per hour, but the other ones use different conversions depending on the heater that you're looking at or what you feel comfortable measuring in. But This doesn't take into account for any heat transfer losses, which can be as high as 50%, depending on the configuration. So it's to keep in mind, kind of on this, we're working with Team Alberta, the commodity groups there, to do some benchmarking of different systems to really figure out what those efficiencies are, because there's so many possible scenarios on the market and what, so we're trying to get some data to add to that to help producers. So hopefully that'll be coming out soon. So here's an example for sizing a heater. So we want to raise the temperature 10 degrees, and we've got in a 5,000 bushel bin, target airflow rate of that 1 CFM per bushel. So we plug our numbers in, and we're looking at needing a heater capacity of about 100,000 BTU per hour. And I said we need to take into account inefficiencies. So in this example photo, there'll be conversion losses in the heater itself, and then there'll be heat losses in any ducting between the heater and the fan. So for this example, we'll consider a 66% efficiency, kind of right in the middle range, and which means we actually need a heater rated at 150,000 BTU. So then you would go and find your heater. Comparably, you could work backwards. If you had a heater, you could determine based on using the airflow what temperature you might see in the bin and whether that's sufficient enough or if you need to upgrade. So back to kind of efficiencies, and we're building on this. Theoretically, it should require about 975 BTU to evaporate a pound of water, and we've tested efficiencies of dedicated air dryers and found that those are actually around 1900 to 2200 BTU per pound of water. And as I said, supplemental heating efficiencies are pretty much unknown at this time for this specific application. But in general, the faster you try and dry grain, the more energy is required. So because we're using a heated air dryer, you're working really quickly. And so we assume, and kind of based on preliminary, that your using supplemental heating will be more efficient in terms of energy required per pound of water removed. So this is kind of in the ballpark, somewhere in between the theoretical and heated air drying, around 1300 BTU per pound. And to compare, this is the tool, the grain drying cost calculator in Manitoba, that can be used for if you're trying to compare a scenario to whether you do need to implement a heated air drying and what that will cost. And we often, kind of one of the things to keep in mind from the economic side is what fuel type you have available. So natural gas is the preferred, and in Saskatchewan and Alberta, this is definitely definitely more readily available. And here where I am in Manitoba, this is the access to natural gas isn't nearly as readily available, and so propane is the fuel of use. But looking at the cost of a fuel and what that works out to be, and here we have a carbon tax, which is really starting to play into things. So when you look at a cost per energy, that you really have to look at what fuel you have. And so anywhere between 92 cents to $4.15 per hour for natural gas and propane for this example of 10 degrees increase on a 5,000 CFM system. So really, when you're implementing supplemental heat, really look into the different scenarios when comparing whether supplemental heat is a good option or whether using a heated air dryer makes sense. And for context, using electricity to run your regular fan on your bin is around 75 cents per hour. So kind of expanding on this, the cost of fuel for grain drying, it really comes down to how well you manage your system. Using a heated air dryer, you're working quickly, and kind of is well established how much time is required to remove moisture from a particular to grain, and we're working on 1/2 to a day to work with 5,000 bushels, for example. Whereas natural air drying, using supplemental heat, we still have to follow the natural air drying principles, making sure that we're running fans when the air does have a capacity to dry, so it's running efficiently. And so this shows that if it's mismanaged and it takes longer to dry the grain sufficiently, and assuming that the heater is running the entire time, if it's managed well, and we have 5 to 7, we get things dried down within a week, we're in the same ballpark operationally for cost compared to a heated air dryer. But if things take a lot longer and not paying attention as much, things aren't as controlled, then supplemental heat isn't necessarily as efficient. So comparing both the capital requirements as well as the operational fuel costs when implementing. So I think we're still good on time. So these are just examples of from our trials that we did, just to kind of show what we learned, but I'll summarize it. So the using heat definitely increases this yellow line, increases the drying rate significantly, but really we found, and so did at a lower airflow. So in this case, if you had to go with a lower airflow rate, you'd still see drying, but not as fast as that 1 CFM recommended. And one thing I'll in this chart that I want to point out is when we're using supplemental heat, we're going to see layers of drying, and in most cases over drying at the bottom of the bin based on the moisture content that is going into the bin in the air. That low humidity is really going to pull moisture out of that bottom layer, and as it proceeds, so by the time the average moisture in the bin is where you want it to be, that bottom grain is quite dry. So one thing we'd like to help work on is how do we manage that appropriately. So those aren't answers we necessarily have yet, but in the final slides I'll kind of hint to some ideas for working with that. But something to keep in mind, that try to aim for a average moisture. So in this case, we heat at that high temperature. We had wasn't complete drying at the top, but right at the bottom of the bin we had well over dry. But in the middle, average was considered dry. Compared to same without heat, higher average, but less variation within the bin. So for the wheat at that with added heat, 10 degrees Celsius and 1 CFM per bushel, we saw it get to average dry conditions after 13 days, whereas none of the other scenarios with or without heat and lower airflow rates reach that dry condition, getting it down 3%. And then when we looked at canola, same scenario, we added heat at various different airflows. We looked at 2 CFM per bushel, just based on how, because of the smaller grain sizes, we need to push more air through to move that moisture out of the bin. And so in this case, at the high heated with the high airflow rate. We actually saw over drying through the entire bin, but fairly even profile. But when we had that 1 CFM per bushel, over drying at the bottom, but average in that dry region that we want to see. So this is still a good condition. And we saw that drying within about 4 days at the CFM, at the 2 CFM. So to show that when you have a higher airflow rate, you can achieve drying quicker, but does require more heat energy. And then, but with the 1 CFM, we get it in about a week or 8 days. So still adequate. So the things we learned from those trials were that, well, of course, we're seeing the need for supplemental heating and heated air drying being needed more. This year wasn't quite as much, but several years before that in a row, we needed to dry a lot of grain. So trying to come up with different options where access to a dedicated dryer might not be make sense or too much to dry. So implementing things that are less capitally intensive or that can be added to bins. So there's lots of different options for adding heat to bins and more coming out by manufacturers, but we don't really know their efficiencies at this time. Ballpark in the 50 to 75% range to be conservative. But the one thing is that making sure you have sufficient airflow rate is likely more critical than the temperature increase because we get a good reduction in air humidity when we add heat, but we need to make sure that we have sufficient airflow to push it right through the grain bulk. And in if the case of not being able to overcome or achieve that airflow rate, we'd always suggest just decreasing the depth of grain in the bin and doing it in smaller batches to really push through air quickly and be the most efficient, and then putting it in a bin to store. And this will help with the over drying at the bottom of the bin too, if you can work in smaller batches. And yeah, add it to the layering. And yeah, adding heat when temperatures are above 10 degrees Celsius, adding heat doesn't really make sense. It's when it's below that that it really plays in. It's really not economically viable or makes sense to do that when drying temperature is good, unless potentially if it's really damp so that you cut that humidity. And we likely, so when temperatures are more than 2% moisture and temperatures are below 5 degrees, that's kind of when we say adding heat makes sense. But we really need to manage the whole process to minimize fuel costs and prevent over drying as much as possible. So definitely an option to look at, but keep in mind it has to be managed. So these are our BMPs. I think I'm getting to the end of my time, so we'll just go through them, kind of summarizing what we know. And these are, we have a frequently asked questions page at pami.ca, which summarizes this entire presentation in a really useful format and has all these BMPs in it. So recommending only using a CSA certified heater and follow instructions for use from a safety perspective. The last thing we want is to try and dry the grain down so it doesn't spoil and then end up accidentally setting the grain on fire because we didn't have a safe setup. Ensuring adequate airflow, this is essential. Minimum 1 CFM per bushel is the aim, but the higher you can do that, the quicker you'll dry the grain. Target the plenum temperatures around 20 degrees Celsius. This is sufficient for the 1 CFM per bushel, but if you can get a higher airflow rate, perhaps by doing smaller batches, then you might be able to get that temperature up higher. That rule of thumb that for every 10 degrees temperature increase, the RH is cut in half. And we want to ensure adequate ventilation in the headspace. So for producers we've talked to that have added heat, this is definitely one that we're looking at how to fix that. So the combo of making sure you have enough airflow rate to push that that moist air right out of the bin, rather than letting it condense on the roof and dripping back into the bin, and making so by having enough ventilation in the headspace, that'll help get that damp air right out of the bin. At one point, we had suggested turning the grain. This one I should have probably stroked off, kind of revisiting this concept and suggesting smaller batches instead. And as with anything, we want to cool that grain back to below 15 Celsius after drying. So using just aeration after the fact to even out that temperature profile, because the grain will now be hot if you've been pushing hot air through it. So we want to make sure we even that profile once it's dry so that it's safe for long-term storage. And so to understand kind of when the grain is actually dry, and for any natural air drying application with or without adding heat, we always recommend monitoring temperature and moisture, likely through the use of cables or other products that are on the market. And that'll prevent overheating, so be able to identify hotspots, and you'll be able to see the temperature profile, moisture profile in the bin, and see when you might have over drying. So these are the final summary. Just so heated air drying takes hours to dry, but the fuel costs around that 20 to 30 cents per bushel. And this is suitable when grain is, I'd actually like to say 3 to 10% over target moisture content, or when large volumes of grain need to be dried really quickly. Natural air drying is the base, about 3 to 5 cents per bushel just in electricity. For your fans, when the grain's just a few points, so in that 1 to 2% over target moisture, and when the harvest season, we're early in the harvest season and temperatures above 10 degrees Celsius. And so where we meet in the middle is with adding the supplemental heat. Our drying time frame is in that days to weeks, kind of about the double the cost to regular natural air drying, but half to a third of heated air drying from a fuel perspective. And that's in that in-between later harvest season, and when you're in that 1 to 3% above target moisture. And you can do smaller batches at a time. So I think that's everything for now. Like I said, those resources are available on our PAMI.ca website. And I think that's it for now. We'll be back for questions later.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Charlie. That Pammy has done a lot of really good work in the grain drying, in the natural grain drying area. So thank you for that. The link is for the research that was done on this is being typed into the chat box and can be found on the SaskCanola website if you're looking for that. So if you have any questions for Charlie or any of our other presenters, please type them into the Q&A box, and we will address them in the 30-minute Q&A session at the end of the last presentation. And also a reminder that if you haven't done so, and you want to get your CCA or CCSC credits for the presentations here today, so please type in your full name and CCA or CCSC number into the chat box, and we can record that for you. Or for the CCA, there will be a QR code that you can scan at the end of the last presentation. Our second speaker is Shawn Senko. Shawn is an agronomy specialist at the Canola Council of Canada. He covers South Central Saskatchewan. His lead topics with the Canola Council of Canada are stand establishment, harvest management, and machinery technology. Shawn is going to talk about canola and barley harvest management practices today. Please welcome Shawn.
Thanks, Keith. Pull up my presentation here. Great, thank you. This is Shawn Senko with the Canola Council of Canada. Today I'll be talking mainly about the harvest management, one of my areas of specialty. I've recently taken it over, but I've been the equipment technology specialist for quite some time. So working with combine manufacturers in that regard. So I've had quite a bit of experience with this. So today we'll be talking, the outline will be, why are we seeing losses that we consider larger than acceptable or, above the economic threshold. We'll talk a bit about what are the actual losses. So there's been a couple projects over the last while that have looked at actual losses in producers' fields. The main part of this talk will be on tools to help measure and mitigate losses. So our new loss app we've produced to help producers in the field actually go out and look at these losses. And then, as Keith mentioned, I'm also the stand establishment lead. So we've got another tool up and running, a plant stand survey tool that we really want producers to use this spring. So at the end, I'll touch on that. So first of all, we'll get started in why are the losses. So there's more than twice the combine horsepower since 1990. An example, I've got one of my combines in 1994, 260 horsepower. A lot of the machines today are 500 plus with even power voltages up over the 600 horsepower range. So processing and cleaning systems cannot necessarily handle what the combine can put through. Another example, I've got another combine in 03, it's 370 horsepower. That same processing system and cleaning system is in a combine you can buy today, again, in that 500 to 600 horsepower range. And I'm rarely at power capacity when I'm combining canola. So the ability to push the material through is definitely there if you're not watching losses. So power is not equal to capacity. Capacity is equal to a feed rate at a specific loss level. And one of the reasons we see the losses is over reliance on loss monitors. So loss monitors can be useful, but only if they've actually been calibrated. So there's been ground truthing with some sort of a loss measuring tool, which we're going to talk about, and checking that against the actual losses that are on the loss monitor. And this is becoming even more important now as a lot of the new combines come with self-drive systems where, there's the limitations on how fast the combine goes. There's a lot of inputs put in there. It's engine load, load coming to the feeder house, but also maximum loss on the loss monitor, which if that loss monitor isn't calibrated, really means nothing. So we can see high losses with those automatic systems if they haven't been set. Here's just a chart produced by Pammy looking at the combine efficiency curves, and this is for all crops. So we usually talk about, staying under that 2% grain loss. And the reason for that is that's kind of where your maximum combine efficiency is. You want to have as little losses as possible, but also we know machinery is getting more and more costly every year, and you've got to be able to use it efficiently to make payments on the equipment and get enough crop off. So you can see by the curve that in that 1 to 2% loss gain, you're gaining a mile an hour from 3 to 4. So that's a fairly large gain in productivity for that 1% loss. But you can see the next, as you go from 2 to 3%, it's only half a mile an hour, and you lose another percent. So that the curve goes up quite sharp after 2%. That's kind of why we say that, being under that 2% losses is kind of the best efficiency for your combine. Where are the losses coming from? So here's one of the projects done. This was done back in 2010 to 2012 by Rob Golden from Manitoba. Over the 3 years, he looked at losses, and these were complete losses. They included environmental losses pre-harvest, losses from the header, threshing losses, and leaks in the combine. So the way this trial was done was after harvest was completed, he'd go out, measure a square foot, vacuum that up, and take all the canola seed that was on the ground. And from that, we were seeing losses in that 2% to just under the 10% range. You can see in the chart in Saskatoon in 2012, the average losses were in that 8% range. So higher than we usually expect, but again, this takes into the environmental losses as well. So a newer study done was by PAMI in 2019. So they went around the 3 provinces, had producers sign up ahead of time that they would allow them to collect. So what this project did was the producer was combining his own field, and PAMI would come with the loss trays. Two of the companies out there provide loss trays, and I'll talk a bit about them later, to put behind the combine. The producer would combine as he normally would, and then PAMI would drop the tray and do the loss measurements. And what they found over this time was the losses range from 0.2 to 4.1 bushels per acre loss in this trial. 1.3 bushels per acre was the average loss. And the interesting thing was when you broke the data up, brand, model, age wasn't a factor. A lot of times you hear it's a certain color of combine, or the older ones throw over more than the newer ones. But what they found from the data, they had a wide selection of both brands and years of manufacture, and there wasn't a significant difference between that. What really it came down to was adjusting to environmental conditions, and that can be from throughout the season, but even in a day. When you first start harvesting in the morning, that material is tough. A lot more of it will stay together. The stems, the branches end up going through the actual processor, through the rotor, over the walkers out the back of the combine. Whereas you get dry, middle of the day heat, that canola material really breaks up, goes through the separator grates and ends up on the sieve, overloading it. So losses were reduced when producers actually went out and changed their settings through the day, not just having one canola setting, but having multiple canola settings depending on environmental conditions. So what we're going to touch on mostly today is measuring those losses in the field. So I'm going to go through some examples on the newly produced Harvest Loss app. And some of the things we're looking at doing with this was to have it usable without a connection. So once you've downloaded it once and used it on whatever device you're using, it should be good for the season. It can depend on if your device does a cache clearing every so often, but it should be good for some time without a connection. It's going to be housed, and I'll show you when we get there, on canolacalculator.ca, and we've got quite a few tools available on canolacalculator.ca. And if you're watching this on your laptop right now and you want to go to on your phone or other device, if you go to canolacalculator.ca right now, you can actually go to the loss tools. So when we get there, you can follow through with me as well and see how it works. The other thing we needed was compatible with all systems. So there are some harvest loss apps out there that work fine, like they're accurate. I used them in quite a few presentations, but we found the limitation was almost invariably in every presentation I had, there were some people who just it didn't work on certain devices. So the idea behind this was, whether you've got a laptop, an iPad, an Android, an iPhone, whatever you've got, as long as you've got a web browser and access to the internet, you should be able to open this system up and use it. And the other thing we wanted was all crop types. So it's available for all crop types, and we'll go through that in the example. Here's the PAMI loss guide. I've handed a lot of these out in the last few years when I present, and they're still a very accurate tool. In fact, when we produced the new Harvest Loss app, the way we calibrated, or I guess checked its accuracy, was to go through the same inputs in this guide and make sure it was the same examples coming out, same answers coming out. So if you've still got these guides and you prefer paper, there's nothing wrong. They still work perfectly well. They're also available on the Canola Council website if you want to print them out. One more thing here. Yes, I'll touch on this when we're in the actual loss app, but this was produced a couple of years ago with Combine Optimization Tool. So what this is if you're having issues, you're seeing losses, you're seeing sample quality problems, you just can't get that sample clean, or productivity, you feel you're just not getting enough flow through the combine, it'll take you through a flow chart and help you, look at those examples. You're having losses and it's over the sieve. It'll go through all the different adjustments that you can make to try and reduce those losses. So just one more tool to help you adjust that combine. So now we'll go to the actual loss tool here on canolacalculator.ca. So here's the canolacalculator.ca landing page. So we've got 4 different tools on here right now, and soon there will be the plant stand survey as well coming up. So I'll just quickly touch on the 4 since we're on the page here. Seeding rate and seeding cost calculator. So this will help you determine the proper seeding rate and what the cost is of that seeding rate. So target plant stand density calculator, helping you target that proper plant stand. We really want to get away from pounds per acre seeding to shooting for a proper plant stand density. So that tool will help with that. The one we're going to look at right now is the, the harvest loss calculator, the new tool that was just launched. And we're going to go through some examples of that. And then next to it is that combine optimization tool that I actually touched on earlier. So here we'll click on the harvest loss calculator. And if you've got another device you want to follow along, that'll work great. So here you land on the landing page for the harvest loss tool. There's some instructions in the top left corner, as well as there's a short video. So what this short video will do is it'll help you with the actual collection of the losses. It's got producers with questions and answers showing how they collect losses. And I can touch on that shortly. There's plenty of good companies out there now who produce loss trays. If you're starting out and you want to just do it on your own, there's examples in the videos. As long as you've got a tray, either something you can throw under the combine or attached to a handle that you can flip over and catch at a loss at a certain point in time. Really anything works to collect those samples. So don't want that to be a stumbling block if you're not ready to purchase one of the professional kits. But I would definitely say that the kits are worth it. They make it much more convenient, safer, and just make it, you're more inclined to check more often with a simple kit and one of the drop trays that are available from producers. There's additional instructions here as well. I won't go through those because that's what I'll be showing you right now. So with that, we'll go to an example. So I'll run through 3 examples here, 2 with canola and 1 with barley. So on the tool, you go to the drop down menu here. All the different crops are in there. So we choose canola. There's imperial and metric buttons here. So that's really what that changes is your cut width, your discharge width from imperial to metric, and then your outputs, how your losses and your value of your losses are showing. So I'm going to stick with imperial because that's what most producers use now. Then there's the 3 methods, and these are the 3 we'll go through. 2 with canola will go on the weight and the volume, and then the barley will go in the end with the count method. So we'll start with the weight method, probably the most accurate of all the methods. If you don't get that sample quite clean, it's not as big a deal with the weight method because chaff doesn't weigh much. So if you've got a bit of chaff in the sample and you're weighing it, it doesn't tend to be an issue. With a weight method, you need a scale that can measure fairly accurately a small amount. You'll see we're looking at a few grams, usually under 30 grams collection. So you need a small battery operated scale. These can be found online fairly cheap on something like Amazon or even sporting goods stores like Cabela's will sell you a reloading scale with batteries for $60 to $100 in that range. So not hard to come by. So here with that, we'll start the example. So in the weight method, first of all, we have our cut width. We'll go 35 feet for a header. So that's either your header or your swath width. Your discharge width, that's what's coming out of the back of the combine. So typically that's your sieve width. Your rotor or your walker discharge will be discharging that same width. So one of the key things to point out here is you really want to drop that straw and that chaff material to do a proper calibration on here. So that'll be your discharge width. So we're going to say 70 inches. On some machines, especially older ones, that might not be possible. Some of the chaff spreaders weren't movable, weighed a lot, and needed hoses disconnected and bolts taken out. So if you're unable to drop the straw into a row, you can still collect samples. Your discharge width will then be whatever your spread width is of the chaff and the straw. So it's not quite as accurate, and you need to do multiple samples across that spread width to make sure you're getting the proper measurement, as chaff and grain will discharge at different areas due to its different densities. So if required, it can be done, but again, the best is to drop the straw. So here we've got our 70-inch sieve collecting area. So that's the size of your collecting pan. So say we've got a pan that's 4 feet long by a foot wide, that would be 4 square feet. Estimated yield, I'm going to put in 52 bushels per acre because that's our goal for 2025, average Canola Council. Dollars per bushel. Last I saw for the fall right now, they're looking at $12.50. So we'll put that as an example. And this really just comes into the economic losses on the side. So now this is the important part. This is what you've collected in that sample. So you've collected what's come out of the back of the combine in the tray. You've cleaned the sample and you've put it on your weigh scale and weighed it, and say we've got 25 grams in that sample. So then output here, it shows us we're losing 100 pounds per acre, which is 2 bushels per acre loss. And it's 3.8% losses. And the value of that loss is $25 an acre. So we can see with this, when we talk about being under 2% losses, the losses are definitely higher than we'd like to see. And we need to make some changes, come back and see if we've dropped that seed loss at the back of the combine. So I'll do a quick touch here on the volume method. We'll go back to canola again for the volume method. So this one, you just need something that'll measure in milliliters or cc's. So again, under 50 mils or 50 cc's is an ideal measurement. You typically won't have much more than that. So anything around the kitchen that measures in milliliters or cc's, even like an old cattle syringe, pull the top off, the plunger out. You can pour the seed in the top and get your measurement from that. So it's a little simpler. You don't require that scale, but accuracy can be a bit more difficult, as chaff doesn't weigh much, but it's got a lot of volume. So if you haven't got that sample clean, you will be overestimating your losses using the volume method. One thing important with the volume method, it's handy to have a set of screens, shaker screens. You can clean that sample up much better. I also like it, touching on harvest management. If you're doing green seed rolling, it helps get you a much more accurate green seed, as a lot of those damaged seeds screen out, and you'll get a better measurement. So a set of screens is very useful for this. If you purchase the professional loss trays, they usually come with cleaning systems with them. So you'll have the ability to clean it out and do the volume measurement that way. So again, I'll just put in quick the same numbers we had before: 35 cut width, 70-inch discharge. That's my sieve width. Collecting area, 4 square feet, 52 bushels. 50, and we'll say we've collected 35 milliliters. Okay, that puts us at 1.7 bushel per acre loss, 3.3% losses. So again, we know we're over. What we'd want to do is make our adjustments, do another drop, and see if we can drop that seed loss and get under that 2% losses. One last thing, I'll touch on the barley here. So I'll reset the form, and we'll go to the count method. I'm using barley because it doesn't work very well with canola. There'd be thousands of seed to count in the count method. So what this actually is you're actually counting the seeds in that loss tray. Even with barley, there's a fairly large number. It's even a better system for something like peas or large seeds like that. So we'll go 35, 70 inches. Collecting area, 4 square feet. Bushels. I'm not really up on barley prices completely, but we'll say about 550 and seed loss. So let's say we count 275 seeds in that pan, so barley seeds. That would put us at a bushel loss and only 1.2% losses. So that's a really low loss, and we've already had to count 275 seeds. So if you don't have, you know, a way to weigh it or a volume method, you definitely can count seeds. It'll just be a bit more time consuming. So with that, I think I've gone through everything we need to on the loss here again. If your losses are high, you can check out the combine optimization tool to help you, make those adjustments to the combine so that we're not seeing those high losses. So I'll go back here to my presentation. So that was the touching on the losses. The last thing I'm going to touch on now is actually our new weed survey tool. So our plant stand tool. So in the past, what we've counted on was the AFC weed survey to assess canola plant stands. It was very good data. We use this for a lot of our projects and information. The trouble is it's only available eventually about every 5 years. So, we want something a bit more often than that. So what we've got, it'll be on Canola Calculator. It's not there yet, but we want you looking out for this, is the Canola Count Survey tool. So what we're asking is that producers go to this, producers and agronomists go to this in either the spring or fall, use the tool to go out and count their plant stand to see what they've actually got. So you've put your seed in the ground, but we want to know what did you actually end up with the plant stand. And the purpose is to drive the adoption of canola establishment assessments. So we really want producers to know what have you got for a plant stand, and what was your actual survivability. We want to collect annual plant establishment data so we know where it's trending and what we need to do for research, and track progress towards what the industry goals are for plant establishment. So if you do this, what the benefits to you as an agronomist or producer are, is to identify your strengths, weaknesses in canola plant stand establishments. So, between variable fields and years, you can see what's affecting your plant stand. You'll get to see how your fields compare to regional averages. So if you put input into this survey, you'll get to see what the other average in that area was. So you know where you stand on your plant stands compared to the other producers. And we've also got prizes. So when you enter plant stand information, you're entered into the draw for prizes for this system as well. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Shawn. Canola Council has got some really great apps there and has done a great job of developing them. And I would encourage you to take advantage of those. So all their apps can be found on the Canola Council website. So, I've also been notified that the Q&A box, or not the Q&A box, but the chat box wasn't open for participants to be able to type in their CCA or CCSC numbers, but that has been fixed now. So thank you for your patience on that. If you have any questions for Shawn or the rest of the presenters, please type them into the Q&A box and we will address them after the next presentation or after the final presentation. So our third speaker is Cory Jacob. Cory is a provincial oilseed specialist at the Saskatchewan Ministry of Agriculture. His work focuses mainly on canola, flax, mustard, camelina, sunflowers, and other minor acreage oilseed crops. He will be giving an update on Western Canadian canola production. Welcome, Cory.
Perfect. Thank you, Keith. I'll just share my screen here. All right, thank you. Okay, good morning, everyone. Thanks for the invitation to come and give a prairie provincial canola crop update. So I'm going to be covering the three prairie provinces, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. So I thought we would start in the west and work our way to the east, so starting with Alberta. So I'm going to highlight some summaries in the table here for the Alberta canola production. So in 2020, we saw 5.8 million tons of seeded acres in Alberta, and that's about 1% lower than 2019 and about 9% lower than the 5-year average. A 40.2 bushel an acre average yield, which really isn't too bad for the conditions. And that is 0.2% lower than 2019 and 4% lower than the 5-year average. And 5.2 million tons of canola produced in Alberta for production, which makes up 27.8% of Canada's canola production. And that production for 2020 is 1.7% below production in 2019 and 8.7% below the 5-year average. So a little bit lower for production in 2020. Now, this slide shows surface moisture ratings from the Alberta crop reporting survey. So I think some of those lower production and yields is being reflected that we were seeing early on. Maybe we weren't too bad, but we kind of dried out maybe later on in the growing season. So as of May 5th, we can see in the southern regions fair to good. And working our way through the other regions, more good to maybe excellent to maybe even excess moisture as we get into the Northwest and the Peace, but across the province varying from fair to good to excellent. And then we got into July, where we had more rain than normal or expected for, in the southern part of Alberta, where we were seeing fair to good to excellent moisture conditions. And then in the central, seeing a good variation and throughout the other regions to maybe even excessive moisture and some drowning out perhaps maybe in the Northwest and the Peace. Now, I did get some little tidbits of information from Keith Gabbert from the Canola Council in Alberta, and I thank him for that. It's a little tougher to get some information out of Alberta with some of their changes lately, but government changes, I mean. So his report was basically a pretty much an uneventful year for the growing season. Like I mentioned before, the South had yields that were higher than expected from a little more rainfall than expected. And then it really varied where you were across the province. There were some drowning out issues in some areas that had received adequate rainfall. So it really depended where you were. And overall, I think that's where we saw, a good yield, but maybe yields in some areas that were a little bit below expected expectations, but still good overall. So this is an overview of the Alberta Canola Disease Survey from Mike Harding's group in Alberta. And this is results of 300 canola fields that were surveyed in their canola survey. And we're seeing the prevalence and the incidence of major canola diseases that they were targeting. So for clubroot, we see 15% prevalence. So about 15% of the fields in the survey had clubroot and about a 4% incidence. So about 4% of the plants that were surveyed within those fields were showing symptoms of clubroot. For blackleg, 44% prevalence and about 5% incidence, so a fair bit of blackleg found throughout the province. That seems to be a trend for all provinces for 2020. Sclerotinia, about 6% prevalence and maybe 1% incidence. And then verticillium stripe, 1% prevalence with no data on incidence. So definitely still seeing some disease in Alberta, even though there were parts of the province that were a little bit on the drier side for moisture. Moving on east to Saskatchewan, we had about 11.3 million acres seeded of canola in 2020, which is down about 3.7% from 2019 and down about 4.4% from the 5-year average. Our yield, our average yield did sneak under 40 bushels an acre. We were reported to show 39.8 by Stats Canada. So I believe that was the lowest yield out of all of the prairie provinces, average yield. That is 4.5% lower than in 2019. And then from the 5-year average, that's 1.2% lower. Production was about 10.2 million tons in Saskatchewan, which is about 54.5% of Canada's canola production. And that change is from 2019. That's 8% lower than our production in 2019 in Saskatchewan, and 5.4% lower than our 5-year average. So this graph really shows the insured acres for Saskatchewan crop insurance, the insured canola acres for Saskatchewan crop insurance in the province. So definitely seeing, canola grown across all regions, not to be surprised there, but higher acres in our black and our gray soil zones, even touching 1.1 million plus insured acres in our east central northeast part of the province here. And then in the brown soil zone in the drier part of the province here, we're seeing even 26,000 acres in crop district 4A, which would be the very southwest corner of the province. So I'm really curious what this map is going to look like in 2021 when we're seeing strong canola prices. We're seeing strong prices among a number of crops. So just seeing if Stats Canada is accurate in their prediction, or if there's going to be a different look to that map for the 2021 growing season. So getting back to Saskatchewan, so we from 2019 there were some harvesting difficulties there and some rainfall and moisture that did give us enough, I guess, subsoil moisture to get a crop going across the majority of the province. But as we did, notice we did dry out later on. So to start out in the growing season, April 1st to about June 22nd, just some rainfall, a lot of areas in the southern and central region, 75 mils or less. So not a lot, but enough to get the crop up and going. And then a little more moisture in the northern and northwestern regions. June 22nd, cropland topsoil moisture conditions were adequate for the majority of the northern regions. Southern regions and eastern part of the province definitely short to very short in some areas, needing moisture absolutely. Now, if we can all remember back to July, which was a little bit ago, we did have about 3 weeks of hot and dry weather in July that really dried us out. And I'm thinking that's where, we're seeing some yields that were still good yields, don't get me wrong, but maybe expectations of higher yields were expected. They weren't quite coming to fruition, I guess. But cumulative rainfall from April 1st to October 19th, definitely, as we can see, kind of the southern and southwestern regions, 175 mils or less, and then more rainfall as we worked our way north in the province, and more or less adequate rainfall in kind of the very northeast and northwest and maybe far west central regions of the province. Now, when we look at October 19th, so right before freeze up, the majority of the province is short to very short on cropland topsoil moisture. Really, only the very northern regions, northwest, north central, northeast, north central, northwest, and west central are adequate. But I mean, that's only going to carry us so far before the crop gets going and using a fair bit of moisture in the soil. There is a fair bit of snowpack as well. I know around this area, which might help with some runoff and getting the crop up and going. But for the most part, we do need a fair bit of moisture to get the crop going this year. And as well, I think Les Henry released his stubble moisture map a number of weeks ago in Grain News, and it reflects what the ministry has been reporting through the crop reporting service, that we're dry and we need a good amount of rain, or even some heavy wet snow in March or April would be ideal. So for the 2020 General Canola Disease Survey in Saskatchewan, we did 261 crops were surveyed for prevalence, incidence of disease, and severity for some diseases. And this was a producer permission-based survey. So we were granted permission to go into every field and share those results with those producers. So I'm just going to go over tip on some highlights from the survey. For Sclerotinia stem rot prevalence, we had 79% of crops surveyed in Saskatchewan in 2020 had at least trace levels of Sclerotinia. So definitely prevalent among 79% of the surveyed fields. And then incidence, an average of 21% of plants in infected fields had Sclerotinia stem rot symptoms. When we averaged the incidence across all fields, we were seeing about 17%. So still, it was there and present, even though it was a bit of a drier growing season. When we look across the regions in Saskatchewan, so in the bottom here, we have Northeast, Northwest, and the number of the other regions and the provincial average here. This is prevalence in the blue bar, and the red bar is incidence. We see Northwest Saskatchewan having the highest prevalence of 100%, so every field surveyed was showing Sclerotinia, and about 25% incidence. And then I believe the lowest would have been East Central, maybe like 62, 63% prevalence. Incidence, maybe 9 or 10%. So, but definitely still saw it among all regions in the province. When we move on to blackleg, we had 81% of the crops surveyed in 2020 had at least trace levels of blackleg, so definitely prevalent in there. For incidence, an average of 18% of plants surveyed in infected fields had symptoms of blackleg. And when we averaged that across all surveyed fields, that was down to 15%, but still, it's there and it's present in our canola fields in the province. So this slide is very similar to the Sclerotinia one. We're just presenting on blackleg here for the prevalence and incidence in 2020. So again, across all regions in the bottom here and the kind of the provincial average where we came out on the far end. The northwest part, the northwest region had about 98% prevalence with about maybe 22 or 23% incidence. And then we see the Northeast having the lowest at about 40% prevalence and maybe 8% incidence. Now, some of the southern regions we're seeing quite high amounts of blackleg as well. And because it's a producer permission survey, they were reporting in our notes and discussions with the producers that there was a fair bit of hail reported, and we're thinking maybe some opportunistic infections after some hail damage to some of the canola plants. But nonetheless, blackleg was still quite there and present this growing season in our canola crops. So moving on from Saskatchewan to Manitoba, the last province I'm going to cover today. So a summary for Manitoba, we had 3.4 million acres seeded, which is up 3.2% from 2019, 4.7% above the 5-year average, an average yield of 41.4 bushels an acre, which would be the highest of the 3 prairie provinces. And that yield is 1.4% lower than 2019 and 0.5% lower than the 5-year average. Now, Manitoba's production was about 3.1 million tons, which counts for about 17% of Canada's canola crop production. And that production in 2020 was 4.4% higher than 2019 and 6.4% higher than the 5-year average. So my throat's drying out here. All right, excuse me. So I want to acknowledge Dane Froese, my counterpart in Manitoba, who had supplied me with some information and slides about the growing season, because when you're not living in that province, you're even more removed to what the situation is. So some of his recollections from the growing season, he mentions rainfall, severe storms, otherwise infrequent, depending where you were, hot and dry in the Interlake region of Manitoba, and there were some late season grasshopper infestations as well. So he supplied me some precipitation maps from Manitoba. So we can see here in May, for the most part, Manitoba was below normal precipitation. A few regions that were close to normal or above normal. If we move into June, we can see regions in the west were definitely above normal, but the Interlake region staying definitely below normal precipitation, and some regions closer to adequate. And then in July, definitely still seeing dry conditions in the Interlake and maybe some excess moisture in pockets or areas of the west or the southern regions of Manitoba. A little more of an overview. He mentioned slow delayed growth in the spring, particularly in southwestern Manitoba, could be attributed to cold and spotty, dryness preventing some uniform emergence. Our friends, the flea beetles, again showed up, severe infestations. They've been an issue for a number of years, and I don't think that's going to change much in the future with our canola rotations and our canola acres, unfortunately. And then patchy rainfall may have led to varied yields. And as I'm going to discuss, saw an increase in disease pressure, notably blackleg and verticillium. This was interesting to just include. This is from Manitoba Agricultural Services Corporation. This is their canola reseeded acres for 2020. So if we look at 2020 here, we're seeing 1,139 claims, which is not as high as it was in 2019 or 2015, but still significant regardless. And about 187,501 canola acres that were reseeded. So I would consider that to be significant. And a lot of that is attributed to dry soils and frost and flea beetle pressure and maybe a lack of crop competitiveness as well. So just the last few slides here, I'm just going to discuss the Manitoba disease survey results. So this is the Sclerotinia incidence from Manitoba. So a bit of a busy slide, but this green colored line is kind of the prevalence of the disease. The blue bars here are when we consider the incidence in all crops, and the red bars are when we're considering just infested canola crops. So if we just focus our attention here on 2020, we're seeing about 40% prevalence. So definitely canola there, Sclerotinia there and present in canola. And incidence, we're seeing maybe 5% when we look at infested canola crops, and maybe 2 or 3% when we're looking at it among just averaging it across all surveyed fields. Now, not as high a levels as they'd seen in maybe 2015 or 2016, but still present in there. And I think showing Sclerotinia is more dependent on conducive environmental conditions for infection as well. Okay, so just going to cover over blackleg. So a very similar slide for blackleg as Sclerotinia. The blue line here is the prevalence of the disease. The blue bars are the incidence when we're talking about all crops. And then the green bars are incidence in just infested canola crops. Focusing over to 2020, about 80% incidence, 80% prevalence of the disease. So quite a fair bit of disease noticeable, blackleg noticeable in Manitoba. And then when we look at incidence in infested crops, we're talking maybe 22, 23%. And then when we're talking about all crops, it's just shy of 20%, maybe 18 or 19%. So regardless, there is still quite a fair bit of blackleg seen in Manitoba this growing season. Maybe not as high of numbers as they reported in 2014, but still it's ticking up there from our acres where they're at and some of the rotations as well. And the last slide, just to finish me off here, there were some comments about lodging and verticillium. Seeing higher prevalence and detection across Manitoba in 2020, heat and lack of moisture in July and August could have been contributing factors to seeing more severe symptoms is maybe one guess that they're giving. And then weakened stems could have seen an increased lodging in some hybrids perhaps. And final comments that yield losses were tough to attribute directly to verticillium. Suspected combination of lack of rain, disease, and late season stress could have been playing a role as well there. So thank you for the attention. I hope I'm not over time, but that is the end of my presentation.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Cory. So if you have any questions for Cory or the other presenters, please type them into the Q&A box. I've noticed that that we haven't had any CCA or CCSC requests for getting credits typed into the chat box. So please let me know if this still, it wasn't working earlier, but if it still isn't working now, someone please let me know and we will try and be able to get that fixed up for us. So our last speaker today is Drew Sharp from Boortmalt. Drew is going to provide us with the best management practices for malt barley storage. Welcome, Drew.
Hi, Keith. Thanks. Can everyone hear me and see my screen?
Yes, Drew.
Okay, excellent. Thanks, Mickey. Okay, so today what we're going to talk about is drying barley, but we're going to talk about it kind of from like a Irish context. So I actually got this slide deck from our agronomy colleagues out in Ireland, and they have a unique style of bringing in barley to their malting plants and drying it. So as I'm sharing this information from you, just remember that it's in a Irish context, so not everything here might fit for your operation, but think about some of the things that are going on in Ireland, and maybe think about how you might use that in a Canadian context. But maybe okay, so this is a presentation about barley in Ireland, but I took that beautiful picture on the right-hand side of the screen in northern Saskatchewan. So a little bit about the company first. So Prairie Malt is located in Biggar, Saskatchewan. That's where our processing facility is. At full capacity, we make about 240,000 tons of malt per year. Now, malt and barley is different through the process. Barley shrinks because when we sell malt, we sell it at about 4% moisture. So that's 240,000 tons of malt. We began operations over 40 years ago with our Wunderhofen unit being built in 1977. And as of November 2019, we were purchased by a company called Boortmalt. And Boortmalt is owned by a collective of farmers, a farm cooperative in France called Axriel. So Prairie Malt is now, it's a farmer-owned business. And it's also a global business. So we have malting plants globally. We're on 5 different continents, 16 countries, and we have 27 different malting plants worldwide. And what we're going to talk about today, if you guys can see my cursor hovering over the screen, we're talking about the malt plant today in Athy, Ireland. In Athy, Ireland, and to give you an idea of what that might look like, here's a picture of our malt plant there. So in the top left corner of the screen, you can see our malting operations, and kind of you can start to see a little bit of farmland in the top right, excuse me, as well. And just note that, okay, you can see some of these croplands, or maybe the paddocks there are quite a bit smaller than the quarter sections, half sections, and sections might deal with in North America. So I'm going to skip over those last few slides. They're pretty wordy. I'm just going to read off that, but I'll stick on this slide because this is the stuff that you should kind of drill into your brain. So in Ireland, they actually purchase and have delivered almost 100% of their barley at harvest time. And then Boortmalt, Ireland, they dry that barley down once they receive it. So the climatic conditions at harvest in Ireland result in grain moisture varying from approximately 21.5 to 15% moisture. Okay, so Ireland is quite humid, and they don't have the warm days that we do. In fact, interesting kind of just factoid. So it's February now. In March, they're going to start to seed their spring barley, right? And then that's not going to get harvested till probably mid-July through August. So that's a much longer growing season too, just because you don't have the same heat units that we do here. So they don't get, barley that's really dry at harvest, so they have to dry it down. So the barley comes off, and it's between 21 to 25 or 21.5% moisture to 15% moisture. And the trucks that they deliver the barley to are actually only 18 tons. So they're pretty small lots. And there's really it's very heterogeneous moisture content of those lots. So as these 18-ton lots come into the malting plant, they have the hydraulic probe. They probe every single lot, and they measure the moisture content. And they say, okay, what is this? If it's above 17.5 or equal to 17.5% moisture, they're going to bin that in one area. And if it's lower than 17.5% moisture, they're going to bin that in another area. And the reason for this segregation is due to the fact that they find that their grain dryers are most efficient when they're removing 4% moisture or less. If they're trying to get, like 6% moisture out of the grain, they're not going to do that. They realize that's the best management practice. So they're going to actually start to dry in different lots. So if you're at 17.5% moisture that's been segregated into one bin, they're going to dry that down to 13.5%, which is generally your contract spec. But if it's above that 17.5% moisture, they're going to dry that down to 16.5% moisture. And then they're actually going to keep that barley now that's at 16.5, and they're going to wait for a couple of weeks till they've, because they have a lot of barley coming in at one time. So they're going to take that 16.5%, they're going to put it aside, say, okay, that's going to be safe for a few weeks. Let's process the rest. We're going to add to that pile of 16.5. And once they're done, they'll double dry that 16.5 down to the 13.5 moisture content that they're aiming for. And so you can kind of see that here. They dry by moisture class. So it's above 17.5, dry it down to 16.5. And if it's 17.5 lower, they're drying that to a stable moisture for long-term storage. And they want it to be below 14. I mean, in North America, your barley contracts are going to be 13.5, and that's best. That's what you should target. But that's what they do in Ireland. Yeah, so they attempt to dry all of the barley that they receive within 72 hours. And because there's, time is, you'll see in a later slide, but high moisture and high temperature barley, it's very time sensitive. And I think you saw that probably earlier in the PAMI presentation. It's really time sensitive as to getting that barley dried right away, ensure its quality long-term. In terms of air temperatures, they don't want the on-air temperature to get higher than 68 degrees Celsius. And their max grain temperature then would be 32 degrees Celsius. After, as the barley is coming out of the dryer, they sample every 10 tons. And for a lot, they're going to sample 10 times. So they're going to have 100 tons of sample represented. And they're going to check the moisture, the dockage, and the germination capacity on those lots. The reason they do that is just to make sure that they aren't going to move that lot into a larger bulk of barley and have a germ that won't work for their malting operations. I think it's probably clear for everyone, but the reason they're so careful with the drying temps is because in malting barley, you must preserve the germ end in order for that barley to be turned into malt. If it doesn't grow, it will not go on to be malt later. So I'm going to leave this slide soon, but before I do, let's just touch on a couple things here. So you saw that the paddock size in Ireland is pretty small. Yours are not like that. And when we're looking at the moisture classes of, greater than 17.5 or less than 17.5, well, there's probably a lot of variability in moisture in your fields. So when you're harvesting, let's say you're harvesting 17.5% barley, that's your average that you got off 1/4 section. Just remember that that average is going to be composed of a whole bunch of different moistures. If you've ever taken any stats classes, you might have heard about the danger of relying too much on averages. If you come to a river and you can't swim and you need to cross it, and someone tells you, okay, the averages of this river is 3 feet deep, do you cross it? Well, when the risk is that great because you can't swim, maybe you shouldn't, because there might be some areas of that river that are 100 feet deep. And so just remember that when you're, pulling off large volumes of grain from your field, although the average might be 17.5, there might be grain in there that's 20% and above, and just keep those numbers in mind when we get to a matrix that shows later in the presentation that shows how grain temperature and moisture content will affect the storability of grain. Okay, but let's assume that you've dried your barley, you've dried it low and slow, so you haven't exceeded a grain temp of 42 degrees Celsius, and now it's in storage. Now what? Next steps. Okay, so you don't want to store barley that's hot you're going to want to cool it down, probably through aeration. So I'll just start to read this next section here. So safely dried malting barley will arrive at the designated storage point in Ireland again at a temperature of approximately 25 degrees Celsius daytime temperature after dryer, up to 30 degrees Celsius. Okay. It is in this storage, it's in the storage period that most damage will occur to the germination end of to barley germination. I think we all know that, due to loss of germination, infection by fungal entities, production of mycotoxins. So we want to aerate the malting barley that we dry after, we want to aerate after drying, initially attempting to reduce the temperature of that grain lot down to 15 degrees Celsius, and then after that, 10 degrees Celsius for longer term storage. And we'll touch on this later in just a few minutes here. It should be noted that in Ireland, the relative humidity is greater than 85% most of the time, which means we have to be extremely careful when pressing air through the bulk of grain, because whilst cooling, moisture can be removed from the air, deposited on the surface of grain, activating fungal activity, heating loss, loss of germination, yada, yada. You've probably heard that already. So in order to prevent such moisture transfer, Boortmalt operates on the following policy. Only aerate if the delta or difference in temperature is 5 degrees Celsius or greater between the lowest grain temperature in the bulk and the ambient air being pressed through the grain. So they want to make sure that there's at least a 5 degrees C difference to make sure that they're cooling in obviously high relative humidity conditions. So talking about more of a North American context, after our barley has been dried, we need to cool it down. And I would recommend in winter, if you can, turn on your aeration fans. Like, you're not trying to dry it down anymore. You just want to keep it cool. Let's actually move here. So this matrix shows at different barley moistures and different temperatures how long your barley can last. And basically, as you move to the left, upper left quadrant, you'll see that at lowest grain moistures and the lowest temperatures, obviously, you're going to have barley that lasts the longest time. So talking about a North American context, one of the things that we do at the malt plant is once we have the barley in, it's dry and sound. When it's, like temperatures like last week, when you wake up and it's minus 51 with wind chill, we're going to turn on the aeration fans, just because we want that barley to be cold. We want to basically make that an icicle, because we aren't going to bring it from the bins until July, August. And when we do actually bring it from the bins, you can see on the leg of that bin, there'll be condensation on the leg. It'll be dripping with water because the barley that we've kept in our long-term storage is so cold. And we found that to be a really effective way of maintaining germ quality. So, I mean, this isn't rocket science. I think these two slides cover it. Well, there is actually quite a bit of science. You can see this, but it's general practices. Dry within 72 hours if you have high moisture barley. If you're taking your barley off above 17.5% moisture, make sure that you're drying twice. You might have to. And remember that there's high variability in your fields, okay? Don't exceed or on your temperature of 68 degrees C, and don't exceed a grain temperature of 42 degrees C. Cool your barley to 15 degrees C as soon as possible after drying, and cool to 10 degrees C or lower for long-term storage. If you can turn your aeration fan on winters to cool down your barley, that might be a good idea if you have contracts for later delivery. Of course, as mentioned in the PAMI presentation, it might not be a good idea to aerate when it's really rainy or foggy if cooling down grain is your goal. And just a visual example of why we do that. This is a quick picture of different fungi species that are active in your grain, in your bins, and the temperatures and moistures that they thrive at, that they're active at. And basically, again, you can see that as you reduce your grain temperature and you reduce your grain moisture, you're going to have less fungal organisms flourishing in storage. So big ones that we're looking out for: Aspergillus, Penicillium, field fungi like Fusarium that can produce mycotoxins, though they're not so aggressive in bins because they're not storage fungi, they're field fungi. But really, you want to keep the grain temperature low. You want to keep it at low moisture as well. And that's really it. I can maybe freeze on this slide for a few moments, but most of your contracts are going to be at probably 13.5 grain moisture. So if you can keep so looking kind of right here on the graph, so if you can keep your barley at 10 degrees C and 13.5% grain moisture, it should store for about 300 days. And that's really it. I don't know where I am at for time here, but we can move on to the discussion when we're ready.
Thanks, Drew. At the beginning of the session here, I talked about the unable to have these meetings in person, and the missing that farmer networking. So I love it how your very first slide you shared a beer with us. We
can't see everyone today, but I'm hoping some of you were quaffing an ale while I was doing it. Or maybe you will later if it's too early.
Yeah, thanks, Drew. So there will be a QR code displayed on the screen here shortly that you could scan in order to earn CCA or CCSC credits. And the other opportunity to earn those credits is to type your full name and CCA or CCSC credit into the chat box at the side of the screen here. At the beginning, it wasn't working, but I see it is working now. So the QR code is up on the screen now. The government of Saskatchewan and its partners are conducting the annual pest monitoring survey again this summer. Information gained from the pest monitoring survey is valuable and directly benefits growers in Saskatchewan and across the prairies. The pest monitoring information allows early detection and mapping of new and emerging pests, gives producers the best knowledge to make better management decisions and anticipate developing pest issues. We encourage Saskatchewan growers to sign up for the pest monitoring program to allow access to your land to conduct pest surveys. So there will be another QR code displayed here shortly up on the screen. And so you could scan that to be able to sign up, or contact your Ag Knowledge Center at 1-866-457-2377. Greater participation leads to greater results. And a week ago, I did scan that QR code in, and I was able to sign up within probably about a minute, and the sign up was done. So it's very easy. If you have any more questions on the survey, we do have Cory and Mitchell on with us here, and they would be able to address those questions if you had them. We are now into the Q&A portion of our meeting. So questions can be asked by typing the Q&A box, and they will be addressed as they come forward. If you have specific presenters you wish to hear from, please address them in your question. So we have a question up here. It says, Charlie, my worry is always putting moisture back into the grain in the cool down stage once it comes off the dryer in winter conditions. So say around -10 degrees Celsius, and the wheat temperature is 24 degrees Celsius, and the moisture brought down to 14.5%. Is there a relative humidity number that is kind of a benchmark to where you might be adding moisture to the grain?
Hi, Raylene. So yeah, good question. I always recommend looking back at those EMC charts that kind of show based on where your air RH, and you can also kind of combine that even though your cold air is coming in, it'll warm up a bit because of as it draws heat from the grain, and so that as it warms up too, it's increasing its capacity, so it'll to hold moisture, so it'll retain. It shouldn't let go of that moisture as it moves through. And when we're looking at temperatures around that below zero, very little moisture migration happens at that point. And when we're talking about aeration to cool grain down, it's happening over the course of 12 to 24 hours. So very little will happen at that point. To be on the safe side, you could always try and bring that average temperature slightly below that 14.5, so you have a little bit of wiggle room. Or if you're adding that supplemental heat, we said that the bottom of the bin will be over dry, so when you're aerating it, the moisture would be added at that bottom if for some reason there was any added back to the grain, and that probably wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. So yeah, look at those charts, but overall it's usually not a big concern from what we've seen.
Thanks, Charlie. Question to Cory about the projected seeded acreage seems to indicate an increase in all crops except spring wheat. What are your thoughts on these projections? Will spring moisture be the biggest determining factor for acreage?
So that's a tough one, but I guess I'm in the opinion with these increase in crop prices that rising waters are going to rise. They bring up all ships and not just one particular crop or price. I do think in the province we're going to be seeing moisture being the deciding factor, as that person had alluded to, with some producer crop planning, with producer crops that they're planning to grow. I'm thinking that the predictions, I did see the Stats Canada release just recently here. I think it's a good, accurate way to start, but I mean, it's never going to be perfect until we actually do see what's seeded, midsummer or in the fall.
Thanks, Cory. Question to Shawn, asking what if you don't drop the straw? And I would think that would be in relationship to your app.
Yeah, I touched on that slightly in the presentation. So then your discharge width actually becomes your spread width if you don't drop the straw. So you need to, when you're entering that that discharge width, which is normally the width of the sieve, and the chopper would be your normal width. You'd put it in as, say you've got a 35-foot header and you're spreading 30 feet. Well, then your discharge width would become 30 feet. The important thing to note with that, though, is as I said, in some machines you have to go that way. Some of the older ones, especially, that just can't be disengaged without a lot of work. You're going to have to take a lot of samples across that entire 30-foot width to get accurate representation of your losses.
Thanks, Shawn. And there was a question earlier that you had answered, talking about when you're talking about the exact measuring of your sieve width. So you just take that measurement right across the back of the combine, correct?
Yeah, maybe I referred to it wrong in the presentation. So we call it discharge width on the app. So typically that is your sieve width. It'll be, I'm thinking, I think the comment was 70 inches might be a bit wide. And honestly, I can't remember what mine are. I know an example, some of the older combines, popular, like a 9600 John Deere, was 65 inches wide. That was your cylinder and your sieve and your chopper. So that would be your discharge width right out the back of the combine. So that's what you'd put in there. So typically your discharge width will be the width of your sieve. Some machines, like certain like gleaners, where they discharge from the sieve and the rotor in separate streams, might be a bit different than that. But on by and large, most part, your sieve width will be your discharge width.
Thank you. There was a question that Drew had answered online, and it talked about the prairie malt supplying malt to what areas and needs of the world. And you had said US, Mexico, Asia Pacific, and locally. So if you want to add some more on to that, and also, is there barley from Western Canada that is shipped over to Ireland to that malt plant there?
So no, we do not ship any barley to Ireland. A lot of the purchasers in Ireland are very concerned about having locally sourced barley. So if you're looking at some of the big brewers in Ireland, they want to be able to say, okay, we've bought barley from our Irish growers, and that's an important part of their branding. So not right now, but maybe in the future. We produce the world's best barley here in Saskatchewan, so maybe one day. But big target markets are US, so that's going to be our main customer. Asia Pacific after that. Mexico is also a big one. And that's the majority, and of course locally. But our local market is really very small. I mean, our batch size is about 640 tons per day. So we could produce malt for, a few weeks and would probably flood the Saskatchewan market for a year. Like literally, that's probably not, I'm not doing the numbers on that, but that's probably not much of an exaggeration. So yeah, we are definitely exporters from our facility.
Yeah, thank you very much.
No problem.
I think we've got most of the questions answered here, but I had one when you're giving your presentation, Charlie. I was thinking about, we're talking about that moisture that we're getting out of the grain, but I've seen lots of times where it's a real problem getting it out of the top of the bin so it doesn't condensate on the walls and flow back into the grain. So have you done any work on that part of it, or what are most farmers doing to get that moisture out the top of the bin?
Yeah, so it's definitely something we've seen as an issue, and unfortunately, we haven't been able to do any testing necessarily to come up with some different solutions. But it kind of in the meantime, our one is definitely making sure you have enough vent space on the top, and that your airflow rates are high enough that it's really pushing it right out the bin. I know there might be some applications where having active vents that are powered to draw air out of the top of the bins, so actually pulling it out before making it condense. And then one other thing I've seen, not in person, but I think a producer had mentioned, is raising the roof of the bins so that there's a space between the roof and the walls, so that when it drips down outside the bin rather than onto the interior of the bin walls. So those are things that we're kind of wanting to look at maybe this year, but really haven't had a chance to go into much detail. So those are just a few things in the meantime.
Thank you. A question from Mitchell Japp. Hopefully I pronounced your last name correctly, Mitchell. Is just wanted to hear Drew's comments on cooling barley down quickly in Saskatchewan versus Ireland, when our barley harvest is often in August or early September. Is it better for Saskatchewan to be set up to get barley dried down with either heated grain drying or supplemental heat drying and aeration?
So that's a good question. Obviously, there's some differences between cooling barley in Ireland and Canada. And I mean, I think a lot of these things depend on operation. Like, so many of these things are very much dependent upon what a producer has available to him on his farm. Like, for a long time in Saskatchewan, I think maltsters were against using grain bags, but something we've actually found is that grain bags, because they have a larger surface area, can be a good way to cool down malt barley short term, even so you maybe had it in your dryer to cool, and putting it in a grain bag, because the temperature drops fairly quickly if the ambient temperature is cool. But to answer the question, so is it better for Sask to be set up to get barley dried down with either heated grain drying or supplemental heat and aeration? I don't know the answer to that. I think it really depends on what you have within your operation. And I'm really not a specialist on supplemental aeration for drying down barley. In fact, I mean, I'm not really a grain drying specialist. I just have the presentation from Ireland. So maybe Charlie has some comments on that as well.
Yeah, I know for kind of working in bin with malt barley, definitely had that question posed, and we've kind of mulled around with it, but haven't gone into much detail. Definitely, as you mentioned, that maintaining the germ and from a quality perspective is really important. So adding heat, the benefit of supplemental heat is, yeah, you're not exceeding that. I think in your presentation you had 40 degrees Celsius for seed temperature. So it could definitely be a good option. So lower temperature drying using the supplemental heat. So it might be a project that we look at doing in our facility.
Thank you. Just a note that we do have Mitchell Jupp he is a cereal specialist for the Ministry of the Province of Saskatchewan for Agriculture. So he's also available as a panelist to be able to answer questions in that area.
Keith,
Yes.
Michelle is actually the research and extension manager at Sask Barley.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much. I just went onto the internet and I got the information off of there. So thank you very much for the correction, Nikki. So if you have any questions too, Mitchell, you could also type them into the chat box. So a question for Cory. You talked about the incidence of blackleg and sclerotinia. But is there an estimate as to the amount of yield that it maybe cost us in 2020's crop?
It's a good question. I would have to go back and, I mean, we do have an approximate yield loss per percent of infection, but I'd have to talk to our pathologist to see what that number is. I don't have it off the top of my head. You know, I think this year a fair bit of yield too was from the dry conditions, but the disease presence, there was probably some, but I wouldn't have that number off the top of my head.
Okay, thank you. And I see I haven't seen any more questions come in. So maybe I'll get you to comment too, Cory, on the crop survey that is for Saskatchewan. Once you sign up as a producer, what can you expect for a procedure when they're coming out to do that crop survey? And what are they looking for?
Yeah, so basically there we're looking for producers to contact because we're trying to get a bit of an internal list of producers and cooperators to work with to work throughout the province. So we're getting good spread and good coverage. So the data, like none of the data shared, it's all kept internally. We're just calling individual producers to see what crops you're growing, so we can get an idea of what we can assign for surveying, getting legal land locations for when we go out, and then really, just discussing with the producer if there's any concerns. I mean, if you're growing a number of crops, you don't have to get every crop surveyed. You might only want your canola surveyed or your lentils or another crop type, and then we go out and do our survey, at the appropriate time. Normally it's probably July, August. And then as the results come in, we do share the results with the producer because, I mean, it's your field, it's your information. It benefits the public and us and the producer as well. So, and we do try to follow up with the producers back and say, well, this is what we found, just as a courtesy, because, I mean, we're using your field, and I mean, we're when it comes to field entrance and sanitation, we're adhering to all the club route sanitation guidelines with wearing booties and disinfecting. The vehicles stay on the road. Try to be as respectful as we can because we appreciate the producer letting us use their field as well.
Thanks, Cory. And I mean, we're covering Alberta and Manitoba also with our top-notch webinar series here this year. So do those provinces have a similar survey, or are you aware of what they do for those provinces?
I know in Alberta, Mike Harding's group, I mean, he's one of their pathologists. They would be doing a survey because, I had talked about some of their results. I'm not sure how they conduct the survey. they might have a route that they go on. That's the only other thing I'm thinking. They might have a designated route rather than our way that we do it. Manitoba for sure does have one. I have discussed it with Dane Froese and then David Kaminsky, their pathologist there. I'm just not sure how they go about participation or producer fields that they use.
Thank you very much. So thanks again to all of our presenters for participating here today and the great information you brought forward. So this is the end of today's webinar. And thanks again for those for the participants who signed up for the webinar. So please join us for our next webinar on soil management, and it's scheduled for March the 4th. The registration page for the upcoming webinars is open and can be found on the SaskCanola, Sask Barley, Alberta Canola, and Manitoba Canola growers websites. And you will receive an email with a survey link when you leave this webinar. So we'd really appreciate any feedback that you could give us towards this. We do want to hear from you. So thank you very much.